"Do not close your eyes," the giant muttered, his massive hands reaching through the blinding white fury of the blizzard to grasp the frozen shoulders of the fallen woman. The wind screamed across the jagged high ridge of the Bitterroot Range, burying the solitary mountain cabin in a suffocating wall of snow. Winona had nothing left to give the storm. Her knees buckled beneath the sodden weight of her flowing calico dress, and the icy crust of the earth rushed up to meet her. The biting cold had long ago stolen the feeling from her slender fingers. She clutched a thin, mud-stained shawl against her chest, a fragile and useless shield against a merciless winter. She had prepared her fragile heart to die here, alone on the high pass. Miles away from the tribal fires, she could no longer call home. What terrible sorrow drives a woman of deep respect to embrace the deadly freeze, rather than remain with her own people? The choices we make when our hearts are broken often define the rest of our days. Stay until the end of this journey to discover the painful truth she carried in the dark. And please, leave a like and comment where you are watching from today to see how far this story travels. The heavy wooden door of the cabin groaned in agony against the gale as Gideon stepped out into the blinding storm. He was a mountain of a man, an aging cowboy with a weathered, tanned complexion that mapped decades of hard living. A thick, dark beard streaked with gray-framed, sharp, serious eyes that missed nothing in the untamed wilderness. He wore a heavy, worn-out thick fur coat draped casually over his massive shoulders, revealing a heavily muscled, scarred chest underneath that seemed completely indifferent to the lethal temperature. He had come out only to secure the latch on his barn. But the faint, colorful flutter of fabric half buried in a snowdrift caught his sharp gaze. Gideon moved with deliberate, heavy steps. His large boots crunched through the deep powder. When he reached the shape, he knelt, using his massive arms to shield the delicate figure from the biting wind. The physical contrast between them was absolute. Winona was petite, her slender frame looking almost like a broken porcelain doll against the rugged, towering bulk of the mountain man. He brushed the heavy snow from her dark, flowing hair with surprising gentleness. Her delicate, fragile features were pale, her lips tinged with a dangerous blue. Yet, even in the grip of death, her face possessed a striking, quiet beauty. Without a single word, Gideon slipped his massive arms beneath her fragile form. He lifted her from the freezing earth, as effortlessly as one might carry a slumbering child. The storm raged fiercely against his broad back, attempting to claim the soul it had already marked for death. But the silent protector lowered his head and pushed through the gale. He kicked the heavy cabin door open, stepping out of the lethal chaos and into the quiet sanctuary of his home. He kicked the door shut behind them, instantly cutting off the shrieking wind, leaving only the steady, comforting crackle of a roaring fire. The heat of the roaring stone hearth immediately rushed forward to drive back the deadly chill. Gideon carried Winona across the small, meticulously kept cabin. He laid her gently upon a thick bed of cured furs positioned close to the flames. The sharp scent of burning pine resin filled the air, a vast contrast to the sterile, lifeless smell of the frozen world outside. Winona remained unconscious, her breathing dangerously shallow. Gideon knew the agonizing, prickling heat of blood returning to half-frozen skin would soon begin, bringing a terrible pain. Before any true healing could start, he moved over to a heavy wooden chest, pulling out a thick, heavy wool blanket. Returning to the hearth, he draped the heavy blanket carefully over her trembling form, tucking the edges around her slender shoulders to trap the vital heat. This was the first true warmth she had felt in 3 days of desperate walking. As the firelight danced across her pale skin, Gideon studied her face. He recognized the profound grief etched into the delicate lines around her eyes. It was a specific kind of sorrow, one he knew intimately from the ghosts of his own silent past. Slowly, the dark, soulful eyes of Winona fluttered open. The sudden brightness of the cabin disoriented her. Panic surged through her chest. She instinctively clutched her damp shawl tighter over her heart, a subtle behavior born from a deep need to protect whatever small pieces of her soul remained unbroken. She expected the harshness she had always seen from outsiders, the cruel judgment or the immediate demands of rough men. Instead, her vision focused on the aging cowboy kneeling a respectful distance away. His masculine, angular face held no malice, only a stoic, quiet observation. Gideon reached over to the hearth, pouring a steaming measure of rich bone broth into a battered tin cup. He wrapped a small piece of cloth around the hot metal and extended his massive, scarred hand toward her. He pressed the steaming tin cup of broth gently into her numb fingers, ensuring she had a firm grip before he pulled away. Winona accepted the cup, her hands shaking violently. The rich, savory steam rose against her face, bringing a rush of life back into her frozen lungs. She took a small, hesitant sip. The warmth cascaded down her throat, settling deep within her chest. She looked up at the giant man, her fragile features expressing a silent, desperate gratitude. Gideon offered a slow, reassuring nod, his sharp eyes reflecting the dancing flames. He stood, giving her space to breathe, and turned to hang his heavy fur coat near the door. As he moved, his gaze fell upon the bottom edge of the shawl Winona held so fiercely. The muddy fabric had thawed, revealing intricate beadwork and specific colored threads woven deeply into the hem. The cowboy froze, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the pattern. The beautiful, suffering widow sitting upon his floor was not merely a stranded traveler. Those distinct markings were the sacred symbols of high tribal mourning, worn only by the immediate family of a tribal chief. A woman of her esteemed standing did not simply wander into a deadly blizzard by accident. She was running from something terrible, and Gideon realized with absolute certainty that whoever was hunting her would inevitably follow her trail directly to his door. The silent cowboy said nothing of his discovery. The markings on the shawl of the widow told a story of deep political danger, but the immediate threat was the lethal ice still clinging to her delicate flesh. Gideon turned his massive frame back toward the heavy wooden chest near the window. The heavy boots he wore made a rhythmic, solid thumping sound against the floorboards, a slow and steady beat that contrasted sharply with the chaotic howling of the storm outside. Winona watched him from the safety of the heavy furs. The dark eyes of the tribal daughter tracked every movement he made, her hands still clutching the damp, mud-stained shawl against her chest. She had learned the hard way that men of his size and race usually expected immediate obedience or payment for their kindness. But this aging giant asked absolutely nothing of her. He returned to the fireside holding a small clay jar. He uncorked the vessel, releasing the sharp, earthy scent of rendered bear fat mixed with crushed pine needles. It was a harsh, stinging medicine, yet highly effective against the ravages of frostbite. Gideon knelt once more, his massive knees pressing into the braided rug of the cabin. He gestured with a scarred hand toward her bare, pale feet. The hem of her delicate calico dress was completely soaked, freezing her skin and offering no warmth. Winona hesitated, a flicker of fear crossing her fragile features. She pulled her knees slightly closer to her chest, a silent plea for physical distance. Gideon stopped immediately. He did not push forward. He set the small clay jar upon the warm hearthstones, lifted his massive hands to show they were empty, and retreated 2 long steps backward. The message was clear. He would not cross any boundary she did not permit. The emotional intelligence of the giant struck a deep chord within the grieving widow. She slowly relaxed her posture, exhaling a long, trembling breath, and extended her freezing feet toward the heat of the fire. Gideon stepped forward again, moving with a slowness that completely defied his immense, muscular build. He scooped a small portion of the pungent salve with 2 thick fingers. The application of the medicine required touching her fragile skin. The scarred, calloused hands of the cowboy were large enough to snap a pine branch in half. Yet, he handled the delicate feet of the widow with the reverence of a man holding a priceless artifact. The ointment stung fiercely at first, causing a sharp gasp to escape the pale lips of Winona. Gideon paused, his sharp eyes flicking up to meet hers. He offered no apologies and spoke no comforting lies, but his steady gaze provided a grounding anchor of shared endurance. He waited until her breathing slowed to a natural rhythm, then resumed his careful work. The soothing warmth of the medicine soon replaced the sharp pain, drawing the dangerous white pallor out of her chilled toes. Winona felt the exhausting, suffocating weight of her grief loosen just a fraction. The silent protection of this mountain man was a profound contrast to the harsh, demanding voices she had fled. Once the medicine was fully applied, Gideon stood upright, towering over the small stone hearth. He moved to the single bed in the far corner of the small room, stripping away the top layers of his own woolen blankets. He dragged a heavy buffalo hide from the wooden peg on the wall, tossing it onto the hard wooden floorboards near the heavy door. He was giving her the only comfortable resting place in the cabin. Winona shook her head, her voice raw and fragile from the screaming wind outside. "You must not do that." The cowboy paused. He looked at the heavy hide on the floor, then looked back at the exhausted woman. He offered a low, rough rumble from deep within his chest, pointing a thick finger at the warm bed, and then crossed his massive arms over his chest. The commanding gesture left absolutely no room for debate. He would sleep on the floor. He retrieved a large tin basin, filling it with hot water from the heavy iron kettle hanging over the fire. He set the steaming basin on a small wooden stool near the bed, alongside a clean, oversized linen shirt of his own. He turned his broad back toward her, staring deliberately out the small, frosted window into the dark, screaming blizzard. He locked his massive hands behind his back. He would not turn around until she had washed away the freezing mud and changed into the dry garment. The dignity he afforded her brought a sudden, hot sting of tears to the dark eyes of Winona. She had been stripped of her rightful home, mourning the tragic death of her husband, and cast out by her own blood. Yet here, in the isolated cabin of a nameless stranger, she found an unexpected sanctuary of profound respect. She quickly shed the ruined, wet calico dress, wrapping herself in the immense warmth of the oversized linen shirt. It hung upon her petite frame like a massive tent, smelling faintly of wood smoke, old leather, and pine sap. She climbed into the single bed, pulling the heavy wool blankets up to her chin. The exhaustion of her desperate escape finally overtook her fragile body. She watched the massive silhouette of the cowboy standing watch by the window, a solid mountain blocking the terrible storm, until her heavy eyelids finally closed. Morning broke with a blinding brilliance, casting sharp rays of bright sunlight through the frosted glass. The howling gale had finally died away, leaving behind a world buried under a pristine, silent blanket of heavy white snow. Winona woke to the comforting smell of strong black coffee and roasting meat. She sat up slowly, realizing the terrible pain in her lungs had dulled to a manageable ache. The giant was already awake, tending to the iron stove with quiet, deliberate movements. He had survived the freezing night on the hard floor without a single complaint. Gideon handed her a warm tin plate, stepping back immediately to maintain the emotional distance they had established the night before. Winona ate the simple meal in quiet gratitude, observing the meticulous order of the small cabin. Every heavy iron tool hung in a proper place. The braided rugs were swept clean of dirt. It was the home of a man who required absolute control over his solitary existence. She wondered what terrible event had forced a man of such honor to live so far from the rest of the world. The cowboy stepped over to the door, pulling his heavy fur coat over his massive shoulders to inspect the damage of the winter storm. He pushed the heavy wooden door open, stepping out into the blinding morning light. The snow was deep, but the sky above the jagged peaks was a clear, piercing blue. Gideon walked toward the edge of the dark tree line to check the perimeter of his isolated land. Suddenly, the heavy, deliberate footsteps of the giant stopped completely. He crouched down beside a line of deep, fresh impressions cutting through the virgin snow. The tracks were not from a wandering elk or a solitary gray wolf. The sharp, churning cuts in the deep powder belonged to horses. 5 large mounts, ridden incredibly hard, moving in a deliberate, tightening circle around the boundaries of the property. The tracking party had not been delayed by the storm. They had ridden straight through the deadly night, and they were already here. The heavy boots of Gideon made a solid, rhythmic sound against the wooden floorboards as he stepped back inside the cabin, closing the heavy door securely against the outside world. He did not speak of the fresh horse tracks he had discovered in the deep snow. He stood by the entrance for a long moment, his broad chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled manner that concealed the sudden tension in his massive frame. Winona sat near the hearth, her posture delicate and alert. She noticed the sudden, subtle rigidity in the jaw of the cowboy, but she possessed the quiet wisdom of her people and did not pry into his thoughts. Instead, her slender fingers instinctively reached for the embroidered hem of the thin shawl draped over her petite shoulders, smoothing the colorful threads in a gentle, habitual motion to calm her racing heart. The radiant heat of the great stone hearth enveloped her fragile frame, offering a deep physical comfort that she had not known in many days. The silence between the aging giant and the suffering widow remained profound. Yet it was no longer a barrier of cold suspicion. It had transformed into the quiet space that exists between 2 solitary travelers who have survived the same relentless storm. Winona cast her dark, soulful eyes around the interior of the small dwelling, her gaze eventually resting upon a rough-hewn workbench situated in the far corner. A tangled mass of leather harnesses and a severely fractured bridle lay there in disrepair. She understood the unwritten laws of the frontier. Dignity was a precious currency, and it was preserved through the honest labor of the hands. No true daughter of a chief would accept charity without offering something of herself in return. She rose slowly from the bed of soft furs, her movements fluid and elegant, despite the lingering exhaustion that weighed upon her slender limbs. She crossed the clean floorboards and approached the workbench, her small hands lifting the heavy, broken bridle. The thick leather was stiff with age and snapped completely through the throat latch, rendered useless by some past violence or strain. Gideon watched her from his position near the door, his muscular arms folded tightly over his expansive, scarred chest. He did not speak a word to command her, nor did he move to intercept her actions. He simply observed with those sharp, serious eyes as she carried the damaged tack back to the warmth of the roaring fire. As she sat upon a low stool, the sharp, earthy aroma of aged leather, mixed with the faint sweetness of rendered tallow and old pine wax, filled the small space, a vivid sensory reminder of the practical realities of survival. To soften the hardened material, Winona utilized a small container of animal grease that rested near the iron stove. She rubbed the oil into the old leather with slow, deliberate strokes of her slender fingers, her touch incredibly gentle, yet filled with an innate strength. Gideon stepped closer, his massive body casting a towering shadow across the cabin floorboards. He reached down to a nearby shelf and retrieved a polished bone awl, extending the tool toward her with a quiet, respectful gesture that required no explanation. He then knelt by the hearth and placed a fresh, split pine log into the flames. A brilliant shower of golden sparks danced upward into the chimney, instantly intensifying the cozy warmth of the room and illuminating the delicate features of the widow. Winona accepted the bone awl, her dark eyes meeting his serious gaze for a brief, meaningful second, before she lowered her head to begin the difficult work. She pierced the thick leather with steady pressure, aligning the torn edges with absolute precision. Instead of using the crude iron rivets common among the white settlements, she employed a traditional tribal method of interlocking knots. She began weaving thin, durable strips of deer sinew through the punctures, creating a pattern that was both beautifully intricate and remarkably strong. A seasoned storyteller understands that the work of the hands always reveals the true state of the soul. Gideon sat down upon a heavy wooden block opposite her, his giant knees nearly reaching his chest due to his massive stature. He watched the deft, unhurried movements of her fingers. He recognized in that moment that this fragile woman possessed a core of solid iron. Her external vulnerability hid a fierce, resilient spirit that had withstood the absolute worst tragedies of life. She did not waste her limited energy on useless weeping. She poured her quiet endurance into the physical restoration of what was broken. The rhythmic clicking of the bone awl against the leather became a peaceful melody within the sanctuary of the cabin. Hours passed in total tranquility, a beautiful example of shared labor, binding two completely different worlds together. The mutual respect between the aging cowboy and the tribal daughter grew steadily without the necessity of verbal declarations. Gideon stood up briefly to pour 2 fresh cups of hot chicory coffee. He placed 1 cup carefully upon the warm stone hearth within her immediate reach, the rich steam rising between them like a silent offering of peace and companionship. Winona finished the final interlocking knot, pulling the sinew tight and slicing the excess with a small knife she found near the hearth. She held up the repaired bridle for his inspection. It was far stronger now than it had been before the fracture, the beautiful tribal pattern blending seamlessly with the rugged, dark leather of the cowboy. She hands the completed task to the giant man. Gideon received the bridle, his large, calloused fingers tracing the intricate weaving with genuine admiration. A soft, approving rumble echoed from deep within his massive chest, a gesture that carried far greater emotional weight than 1,000 spoken words. For a brief moment, the emotional distance between them completely dissolved. They sat together in the gentle glow of the dying fire, 2 outcasts who had found a temporary island of safety in a harsh and unforgiving wilderness. Winona looked at the massive, scarred hands of Gideon, realizing that true protection did not always manifest as physical violence. Sometimes, it was found in the quiet willingness to hold space for a broken heart. As Gideon rose to hang the beautifully repaired bridle upon the timber wall, Winona stood up to stretch her aching muscles. Her eyes wandered along the heavy wood walls of the cabin, tracing the rough-hewn logs that the giant man must have cut and stacked with his own incredible strength. Her gaze drifted upward to the main mantle beam, directly above the roaring fire, where the shifting firelight cast deep, moving shadows into the dark pine. Suddenly, her breath caught sharply in her throat, her fragile features turning instantly pale as all the warmth drained from her face. Carved deeply into the exact center of the dark pine beam was a specific, unmistakable insignia. It was a roaring wolf head flanked by 2 crossed cavalry sabers. Winona knew that mark intimately. It was the unique symbol of the lawless volunteer militia that had raided her ancestral valley 3 winters ago, the very raid that had claimed the life of her beloved husband and shattered the peace of her tribe. She stared at the carving in absolute horror, her heart hammering violently against her ribs as she realized the silent protector standing just feet away was connected to the darkest tragedy of her past. The heavy silence of the cabin shattered under the sudden, violent thumping of hooves against the packed snow outside. Winona stumbled backward from the carved mantle, her dark eyes wide with sudden terror. The cruel emblem of the lawless militia still burned into her vision, a ghost from a broken past, but the immediate threat, roaring outside the walls, demanded all her attention. Before a single word could pass the pale lips of the widow, a harsh voice shouted from the front yard, followed by the heavy thud of a fist pounding against the thick wooden door. The sound sent a physical shockwave through the delicate frame of Winona. She instinctively retreated into the shadows of the far corner, her trembling hands clutching the damp, mud-stained shawl tightly against her racing heart. The subtle behavior was an involuntary shield against a world that had taken everything from her. Gideon did not look at the carved beam. He looked only at the terrified woman. The massive giant moved with terrifying speed, closing the distance between them without making a single sound. He did not touch her, respecting the boundary they had established. But he extended one large, scarred hand toward the dark recess behind the heavy woolen blankets of the bed. He pointed a thick finger toward the deepest shadows, a silent command for her to hide. Winona obeyed immediately, sinking below the edge of the heavy mattress. The harsh voice outside demanded entry once more, calling out for missing strays. The men from the valley had arrived. Gideon turned his broad back to the trembling widow. He strode across the floorboards. The boots of the cowboy made no hurried sounds, only the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man marching toward an inevitable conflict. He unlatched the heavy iron bolt and pulled the door open, stepping squarely into the frame. The blinding glare of the midday sun, reflecting off the deep snow, flooded the entrance. 5 men sat upon restless horses just beyond the edge of the porch. They wore heavy coats of canvas and leather, their faces hardened by the bitter wind and a lifetime of cruel labor. The sharp, metallic jingle of spurs and the snorting of exhausted horses filled the freezing air. A vivid sensory moment washed over the cabin as the bitter cold rushed inward, carrying the foul stench of wet wool, cheap tobacco, and the unwashed sweat of violent men. The leader of the riders urged his massive roan horse a step closer. The man possessed a sneering, arrogant face covered in dark stubble. He leaned over the saddle horn, peering past the massive bulk of the giant, trying to see into the dim interior of the home. He declared they were hunting for stolen property and runaways. The harsh words were a thin veil for opportunistic cruelty. The men of the valley clearly did not respect the isolation of the mountain man, but they entirely feared his immense, muscular build. Gideon positioned his massive frame precisely in the center of the doorway. He spread his thick boots shoulder-width apart, resting one heavy hand against the wooden frame and the other against the opposite jamb. He became an impenetrable physical barrier of muscle and bone. The wide-legged coarse trousers and the thick fur coat of the aging cowboy seemed to expand, completely blocking the interior of the cabin from their cruel eyes. He was a living fortress. Absolutely unmovable, Winona huddled in the dark corner, her fragile features completely hidden behind the draped blankets. Her breath caught tightly in her throat. She expected the mountain man to step aside to avoid trouble. She expected the brutal men to push their way inside and drag her back into the freezing storm. Every muscle in her slender body prepared for the violent struggle of capture. Instead, she witnessed a profound act of public protection. Gideon did not shout in anger. He did not draw the heavy revolver strapped to his hip. He simply stared at the mounted leader with sharp, serious eyes that held the lethal promise of a winter avalanche. The utter silence of the giant was far more terrifying than any verbal threat. He projected an aura of absolute consequence. The deep wrinkles around his eyes tightened into a mask of pure granite. The unspoken message was completely clear to every man in the yard. Any rider who attempted to cross the threshold of the door would not leave the mountain alive. A long, agonizing tension stretched across the frozen yard. The horses stepped nervously in the deep powder, sensing the impending violence. The leader of the men spat a dark stream of tobacco juice into the pristine snow. He muttered a filthy curse beneath his breath, ultimately lacking the courage to challenge the silent protector. He yanked the leather reins of his horse roughly, turning the animal away from the cabin. The other riders quickly followed suit, casting resentful glances over their shoulders as they spurred their tired mounts back toward the dark tree line. Gideon did not move a single muscle until the riders disappeared completely into the distant pines. Only when the sound of hooves faded into the whistling wind did he step backward and pull the heavy door shut. He slid the thick iron bolt firmly into place, locking the harsh world outside once again. The sudden silence that fell upon the small room was thick with unspoken emotion. The giant turned slowly, his broad chest rising and falling with controlled breathing. He walked toward the stone hearth and added another heavy log to the dying embers. A soft, golden warmth bloomed instantly across the floorboards, reaching the dark corner where the widow trembled. This was a deep, resonating warmth beat. Gideon did not demand gratitude from the frightened woman. He did not boast of his bravery or the danger he had just faced. He simply restored the physical comfort of the room, offering her the quiet reassurance that the terrible threat had passed. Winona slowly emerged from the shadows, her delicate hands releasing their desperate grip on the muddy shawl. The overwhelming fear in her chest began to dissolve, replaced by a deep, meaningful emotional reflection. She realized in that quiet moment that true protection did not require boastful words or cruel violence. True protection was the quiet willingness to stand as an unbreakable shield, to absorb the hatred of the world so that someone smaller could remain safe. The emotional safety she felt in the presence of this silent giant was unlike anything she had ever known. She stepped closer to the roaring fire, the beautiful heat washing over her delicate calico dress. She looked at the massive man. He stood near the frosted window, staring out at the empty, frozen yard with a heavy sorrow in his posture. Another quiet warmth beat settled over them as he poured a fresh cup of hot water and placed it gently on the table for her. He maintained the respectful distance, allowing her nerves to settle naturally. The men from the valley had looked at him, not with the respect owed to a fellow rancher or a neighbor, but with the deep, sneering disgust reserved for a hated outcast. They had spoken to him with total contempt. The emotional progression of the morning settled heavily upon her heart, shifting her perspective entirely. She had seen the cruel emblem carved into his mantle, linking him to the violent militia. Yet she had just witnessed his absolute rejection by his own kind. The aging cowboy was completely shunned by the world below. a solitary ghost haunting the high ridges. She looked at his scarred, weathered face. A face that had just risked everything to protect a tribal daughter he barely knew. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. What grave sin had this honorable giant committed to deserve such absolute, bitter isolation? The cold morning light broke over the jagged peaks, painting the deep snow in shades of pale gold and deep violet. The heavy wooden door of the cabin had remained securely bolted throughout the long night, keeping the terrifying memories of the violent militia and the hostile riders safely at bay. When dawn finally arrived, the harsh realities of survival upon the high ridge demanded the immediate attention of the aging cowboy. Gideon stepped out into the freezing air, his breath forming thick white clouds before his weathered face. A wild roan mustang was trapped within the heavy timber rails of the corral, a traumatized beast that had arrived wandering and half-starved days before the great blizzard. Winona emerged slowly from the safety of the cabin shortly after. She wrapped the oversized linen shirt tightly around her slender frame, the thick fabric providing a sturdy layer beneath her mud-stained calico dress and the colorful tribal shawl. As she stepped onto the wooden planks of the porch, her delicate fingers immediately sought the intricate beadwork along the hem of the shawl. She smoothed the colorful threads in a slow, rhythmic motion. This subtle recurring behavior brought a small measure of grounding order to a world that had completely fractured around her. The bitter wind bit at her pale cheeks, but the bright morning sun offered a deceptive layer of warmth. Gideon noticed her quiet arrival immediately. He paused his dangerous work near the heavy wooden gate. The giant man walked toward the porch, his massive boots crunching loudly in the packed powder. He carried a thick wool blanket and a steaming tin cup of sweet pine tea. Without speaking a single word, he draped the heavy blanket gently over the wooden railing near her resting hands and placed the warm cup beside it. It was a quiet offering, a profound warmth beat that demonstrated his constant, unspoken vigilance over her fragile comfort. Winona nodded her silent gratitude, wrapping her freezing hands around the hot metal. She watched the cowboy return to the center of the corral. The wild mustang was absolutely terrified. The animal threw its massive head violently, kicking the thick timber rails with enough force to shatter solid bone. Gideon held a thick leather rope, using his immense muscular build to anchor the panicked beast. The heavy muscles in the broad back of the giant bunched and flexed beneath the coarse fabric of his shirt as he braced his boots against the frozen earth. He used absolute physical dominance to prevent the animal from injuring itself. But the sheer force only seemed to escalate the terror of the creature. A vivid sensory moment consumed the freezing yard. The sharp, violent cracks of heavy hooves striking frozen timber echoed across the silent mountain. Hot, white plumes of breath erupted from the flared nostrils of the frantic horse, mingling with the sharp, earthy scent of disturbed winter mud and the raw, metallic smell of absolute panic. The wild, rolling eyes of the roan showed nothing but a desperate desire to escape. The aging cowboy possessed the immense physical strength to hold the animal, but he clearly lacked the delicate remedy required to heal the invisible, bleeding wounds of the traumatized creature. Winona set her steaming cup upon the porch railing. She saw the profound struggle of the giant, recognizing that the brute strength of the man was entirely failing to conquer the deep fear of the horse. She stepped down from the wooden porch, the hem of her flowing dress sweeping across the pristine snow. She approached the heavy wooden rails of the corral with a quiet, fearless grace. The sudden movement caught the sharp eyes of Gideon, and the fierce protective instincts of the giant flared to life instantly. Gideon shifted his massive frame, attempting to position his broad chest as an impenetrable physical barrier between the dangerous animal and the petite widow. He offered a low, rumbling warning from his throat, a sound demanding she retreat to safety. However, Winona gently raised her slender hand, signaling the anxious giant to hold his ground. She did not stop. She ducked gracefully between the thick wooden rails, stepping directly into the dangerous enclosure. The wild horse reared back in alarm, but Winona stood her ground with complete stillness. She closed her dark eyes for a brief moment, drawing a slow, deep breath of the freezing air. Then, she began to sing. It was a soft, rhythmic tribal lullaby, a haunting melody born from the ancient high plains and passed through generations of her esteemed people. The beautiful notes carried across the frozen yard, completely devoid of fear or domination. The song was a gentle current of pure compassion, speaking an ancient language of peace that required no translation. The melody rose and fell naturally, weaving a blanket of unseen comfort over the chaotic energy of the panicked beast. The transformation was immediate and profound. The violent thrashing of the horse ceased entirely. The wild, rolling eyes of the roan locked onto the fragile woman. Winona took a single step forward, her movements as fluid as falling water. She extended her empty hand toward the large, trembling muzzle of the creature. The melody continued to flow from her pale lips, wrapping the terrifying world in a cocoon of profound emotional safety. The massive animal lowered its head slowly, exhaling a long, shuddering breath, and pressed its soft nose against the delicate palm of the widow. Gideon stood absolutely frozen in the center of the corral. He dropped the heavy leather rope into the snow. A deep, meaningful emotional reflection washed over the solitary mountain man. He had spent his entire life wielding physical force, relying upon his intimidating size and stoic endurance to survive the cruelties of the frontier. He always believed that safety was constructed strictly through muscle and iron. Yet, as he watched the slender, suffering widow calm a dangerous beast with nothing but a gentle song, he realized true power resided within a peaceful heart. He was deeply humbled by her quiet wisdom. The giant stepped forward, moving with extreme caution, so he would not shatter the peaceful spell. He stopped directly beside Winona, their shoulders almost touching. He raised his massive, calloused hand, resting his thick fingers gently upon the coarse neck of the horse, mere inches away from her slender touch. This shared space created a beautiful, resonating warmth beat, a silent acknowledgement of their combined effort. Two outcasts from entirely different worlds standing together in the snow, bringing peace to a broken creature. Gideon looked down at the tribal daughter. The harsh, serious lines of his weathered face softened completely, replaced by a look of profound admiration and growing comfort. He offered a slow, deeply respectful nod. A third warmth beat that validated her incredible skill and elevated her to an absolute equal in his eyes. He did not speak, but the quiet reverence in his sharp eyes conveyed a deep gratitude for the unique light she had brought into his isolated, dark world. Winona returned his gaze, a fragile, beautiful smile touching her pale lips for the very first time. The shared cooperation filled her chest with a strange, unfamiliar warmth. However, as the final notes of the ancient lullaby faded into the biting wind, a sudden, devastating realization struck her heart. The gentle song she had just sung was the favorite melody of her fallen husband. It was the exact same lullaby she had sung to him as he drew his final, agonizing breath following the cruel raid upon their valley. The fragile smile shattered instantly. The crushing weight of her profound grief crashed violently through the temporary peace. Hot tears welled in her dark, soulful eyes, spilling over her pale cheeks in a sudden torrent of uncontrollable sorrow. She pulled her trembling hand away from the horse as if the animal had burned her flesh. The sudden wave of emotion completely overwhelmed her quiet resilience. She turned away from the comforting presence of the giant, unable to bear the heavy weight of the memories. Before Gideon could reach out to catch her, she broke into a desperate run. She fled past the heavy wooden rails of the corral, rushing blindly into the dark, dense line of the frozen woods. Gideon stepped forward quickly to follow her into the timber, but a terrifying sound stopped the blood in his massive chest. Rising from the exact direction where the weeping widow had just vanished, the long, chilling howl of a starving wolf pack shattered the quiet morning, signaling the beginning of a deadly hunt. The freezing timber swallowed the fragile widow whole. The terrifying howl of the starving pack echoed through the dense pine trees, freezing the blood within the veins of the giant. Gideon did not hesitate for a single second. He abandoned the corral and charged into the deep, unbroken snow. His massive legs pumped like iron pistons beneath his wide trousers. He moved with a terrifying speed that completely defied his immense, muscular bulk. The dark shadows of the ancient forest closed around him, but the fierce protective instincts of the cowboy burned brighter than the blinding winter sun. The bitter wind whipped the heavy pine branches violently, masking the desperate sounds of the fleeing woman. He found her a half-mile deep into the unforgiving wilderness. Winona had collapsed at the base of a massive cedar tree. The crushing weight of her sorrow had finally drained the last remaining reserves of her physical strength. She knelt in the deep powder, her slender shoulders shaking violently as uncontrollable sobs tore through her chest. Her delicate hands instinctively found the beaded hem of her shawl, her pale fingers tracing the colorful threads in a desperate, recurring attempt to ground her shattered spirit. Just beyond the edge of the snowy clearing, low shadows slinked through the thick brush. The hungry, yellow eyes of the wolves locked onto the weeping woman. They circled with lethal intent, sensing the absolute vulnerability of an easy prey. Gideon erupted from the dark tree line like an angry force of nature. He placed his towering, massive frame directly between the grieving widow and the creeping shadows. He raised the heavy iron barrel of his rifle toward the pale winter sky. He pulled the heavy trigger. A deafening roar shattered the quiet forest. A blinding flash of fire illuminated the dark timber, completely freezing the terrifying advance of the pack. The sharpness, bitter scent of burnt black powder entirely overwhelmed the natural smells of wet bark and freezing pine sap. The vivid sensory explosion sent the cowardly predators scattering instantly back into the deep, invisible reaches of the wilderness. The sudden violence of the gunshot caused Winona to gasp sharply. She looked up through her blinding tears. The aging cowboy stood over her, like an unbreakable guardian carved from solid mountain stone. He lowered the smoking weapon. He did not yell at her for running away into the deadly cold. He did not demand an explanation for the sudden flood of tears. He recognized the sacred nature of profound, overwhelming sorrow. Gideon unfastened the heavy horn buttons of his thick fur coat. He slipped the massive garment off his broad shoulders, standing in the freezing wind with only his coarse, worn-out shirt to shield his scarred chest. He knelt beside her in the deep snow. He wrapped the heavy, warm fur securely around her trembling form. This deep, resonating warmth beat transferred the vital heat of his own body directly into her freezing bones. He extended his large, calloused hand toward her. Winona looked at his thick fingers, hesitating only a second before she placed her small, cold hand firmly into his steady grip. He pulled her gently to her feet. He did not carry her. He offered her the quiet dignity of walking under her own power, guiding her silently back through the dark woods toward the distant safety of the cabin. The slow return journey passed in total, respectful silence. The heavy wooden door closed securely behind them, locking the harsh, cruel world away once again. The fire in the great stone hearth had dwindled to glowing red embers during the sudden chaos. Gideon moved slowly across the room, his massive chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm as he fed fresh, dry wood to the hungry flames. He retrieved a smooth, flat river stone from the warm edge of the hearth, wrapping the heated rock carefully in a thick piece of clean wool. He placed the warm bundle at the foot of her bed beneath the heavy woolen blankets. This second cabin, quiet warmth beat, offered a profound physical comfort that allowed her exhausted, freezing muscles to finally relax. Winona climbed into the soft bed, pulling the heavy furs all the way up to her chin. A deep, meaningful emotional reflection settled over her fragile heart as she watched the giant man return to his workbench. He did not demand she dry her tears. He did not attempt to fix her brokenness with clumsy, empty words. Most men viewed grief as a frustrating inconvenience or a weakness to be swiftly conquered. This solitary mountain man viewed her sorrow as a sacred wound deserving absolute respect. The emotional distance between them vanished completely in the quiet cabin, replaced entirely by a profound, unbreakable trust. She closed her dark, soulful eyes, finally feeling entirely safe. The quiet clicking of a sharp knife against soft wood filled the small cabin late into the night. Gideon sat near the dancing light of the fire, his large, scarred hands working meticulously with a small block of pale birch. The giant man poured his unspoken understanding into the tiny creation, his sharp eyes focused entirely on the delicate task. When the bright morning sun finally pierced the frosted window panes, Winona awoke to a completely silent room. The cowboy had already gone outside to tend the restless horses. She sat up slowly, feeling a renewed, vital strength flowing through her slender limbs. She looked toward the small wooden table situated beside the bed. Resting squarely in the exact center of the rough timber surface was a tiny, perfect object. It was a delicate wooden dove, carved with breathtaking precision and sanded to an impossible smoothness. Winona reached out with trembling fingers, picking up the beautiful carving. The smooth wood felt warm against her delicate skin. It was a silent tribute, a perfect third warmth beat that honored the profound grief she carried for her fallen husband. The aging giant could not speak the complex language of her healing heart, but he had crafted a tangible symbol of peace to show he completely understood her immense pain. A hot tear of pure, overwhelming gratitude slipped down her pale cheek. She pressed the little wooden dove against her chest, holding the sacred gift close to her heart. She stood up, pulling the thick tribal shawl securely over her shoulders. She wanted to step outside and offer the giant a proper expression of gratitude for the beautiful keepsake. She walked toward the heavy wooden door, pulling the iron bolt back with a solid, echoing clack. She pulled the door open, stepping out into the freezing morning air. A sharp, terrifying whistle cut through the quiet yard. A heavy wooden shaft slammed violently into the thick doorframe directly beside her head, sending a sharp spray of broken splinters across her pale cheek. Winona gasped, stumbling backward into the cabin in total shock. The heavy shaft vibrated violently within the solid wood. Attached to the end of the deadly arrow were 3 distinct feathers, dyed in brilliant shades of deep crimson and black. The breath completely left the lungs of the fragile widow. The intricate carving of the dove tumbled from her trembling hands, striking the floorboards with a dull thud. The specific colored feathers belonged exclusively to one man, They were the absolute, undeniable signature of the new chief of the tribe, and the deadly weapon carried a terrifying message of impending war. The deadly arrow still vibrated violently within the solid wood of the doorframe. Winona stood frozen in absolute terror, the breath entirely stolen from her lungs. The sudden, chaotic splintering of the timber completely shattered the quiet peace of the morning. Gideon moved with the terrifying speed of a striking viper. He did not slam the heavy door shut to cower inside the cabin. He threw the heavy wooden portal wide open, stepping out onto the frozen porch with his massive chest thrust forward to meet the sudden danger directly. A line of mounted warriors emerged slowly from the dark shadows of the pine trees. A vivid sensory moment washed over the freezing porch as the bitter winter wind suddenly carried the harsh scent of war paint, wet animal hair, and the sharp, metallic tang of drawn steel. The men rode restless, heavily muscled horses, their faces painted in the stark ash and deep ochre of a dedicated hunting party. At the exact center of the terrifying formation sat the brother of Winona. He wore the heavy, adorned buffalo robes, reserved exclusively for the new chief of the tribe. The brilliant feathers woven into his thick hair matched the deadly shaft currently buried in the home of the giant. The brother of Winona pulled his massive painted stallion to a halt just beyond the edge of the snowy yard. The deep, heavy silence of the mountain hung between the two completely different worlds. The aging cowboy stood at the edge of the porch, his wide-legged trousers brushing against the deep powder. He did not reach for the heavy revolver resting upon his hip. He simply crossed his thick arms over his expansive, scarred chest, turning his massive frame into an absolute physical barricade. "You will bring the woman forward," the chief commanded, his dark eyes fixed entirely upon the intimidating bulk of the mountain man. The voice of the leader held no warmth, only the cold, hard edge of absolute authority. Winona stepped slowly out of the shadows of the cabin, the oversized linen shirt of the cowboy offering a stark contrast to the colorful tribal shawl draped over her fragile shoulders. As she moved into the harsh morning light, her delicate fingers instinctively sought the intricate beadwork along the hem of the muddy fabric. She smoothed the colorful threads in a slow, rhythmic motion, a subtle recurring behavior that anchored her racing heart against the overwhelming tide of panic. "You have mourned long enough," the chief declared, his gaze shifting to his fragile sister. "The political winds have changed. You will return with us today. You will marry the leader of the northern camp. Our people require the treaty, and you will perform your duty for the peace of the valley." The cruel demand struck the suffering widow like a physical blow. The leader of the northern camp was a brutal, merciless man known for his extreme violence and deep cruelty. A profound, meaningful emotional reflection settled heavily upon her breaking heart. She stared at the man she had loved and trusted as a protector her entire life. She suddenly realized the terrible, devastating truth. Her own blood relative viewed her grief as a foolish inconvenience. He saw her only as a piece of disposable property, a convenient tool to purchase political power. She turned her dark, soulful eyes toward the silent giant standing beside her. The solitary mountain man, an outcast hated by his own kind, had honored her sorrow. He had surrendered his only bed, shielded her from ruthless men, and offered her profound, quiet dignity without demanding a single thing in return. The contrast between the betrayal of her blood and the honor of the stranger completely shattered her old world. The paradigm shifted entirely in that freezing moment. Gideon looked down at the terrified woman. He saw the complete despair washing over her delicate, fragile features. The giant shifted his immense weight. He uncrossed his arms, reaching out slowly to place his massive, calloused hand lightly upon her delicate shoulder. This first quiet warmth beat provided a sudden, powerful surge of courage directly into her trembling bones. He did not grip her tightly. He simply offered his steady, unbreakable presence. The cowboy then knelt slowly onto the frozen planks of the porch. He reached his large fingers toward the dropped wooden carving that lay near the threshold. He picked up the delicate, perfect wooden dove, wiping a single flake of snow from the smooth wood. He stood to his full, towering height and pressed the tiny carving gently into her small palm. This second warmth beat reminded her of the deep, sacred respect he held for her broken heart. Finally, Gideon took 2 heavy, deliberate steps backward. He completely removed his massive frame from the path between the widow and the war party. This ultimate warmth beat was an act of profound, breathtaking respect. He gave her the total freedom to choose her own destiny. He would gladly fight to the bitter death if she wished to stay, but he absolutely refused to hold her captive or dictate her fate. He offered her the supreme dignity of absolute autonomy. Winona closed her slender fingers tightly around the wooden dove. The beautiful heat of the small carving banished the freezing terror from her chest. She stood tall, her spine straightening with the ancient, unbreakable pride of her people. She looked directly into the harsh, cruel eyes of the new chief. "I will not go," Winona answered, her voice carrying a quiet, ringing iron that cut through the whistling wind. "You have sold my honor to purchase a coward. I no longer call you family. I choose exile." The shocking refusal rippled through the mounted warriors. The face of the chief twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The realization of a shared destiny settled completely upon the fragile widow. She belonged nowhere now. The tribe had cast her out, and the white settlements would never accept her. Her only true sanctuary in the entire world was the silent, honorable giant standing quietly in the shadows behind her. The furious chief yanked the heavy leather reins of his stallion, forcing the massive beast to rear back onto its hind legs. The horse kicked the frozen air wildly as the leader raised his heavy, feathered spear toward the pale, uncaring sky. The total rejection by his sister was an unforgivable public humiliation. "You have chosen the path of the dead," the chief promised, his dark eyes burning with absolute hatred as he pointed the tip of the weapon directly at the chest of the aging cowboy. "Enjoy the snow while you can breathe. Before the next full moon rises, we will return with the entire war party. We will burn this mountain to ash. The giant will bleed out in the dirt, and you will return to the northern camp in iron chains." The heavy silence of the mountain rushed back into the frozen yard as the war party disappeared into the dark timber. Winona stood upon the wooden porch, her small fingers clutching the tiny wooden dove tightly against her racing heart. The terrifying threat of the chief hung heavily in the bitter air, a promise of absolute destruction that would arrive before the next full moon. Gideon did not watch the riders leave. He turned his massive frame slowly, his sharp eyes sweeping over the solid timber walls of the small cabin. He had built this sanctuary with his own calloused hands. For a decade, the heavy logs had shielded him from the cruel judgments of the world. Now, the absolute safety of the home was completely shattered. The aging cowboy walked past the trembling widow, offering a gentle, reassuring nod. He did not waste time with useless panic or angry words. The giant man moved with deliberate, heavy purpose, pulling thick canvas sacks from the large wooden chest near the window. Winona understood the unwritten language of his actions immediately. They could not stay. If they remained, the war party would return with greater numbers and slaughter them both. The fragile daughter of the tribe stepped into the cabin, placing the delicate carving safely into the deep pocket of the oversized linen shirt. She joined the silent preparation, her delicate hands folding thick wool blankets and packing the dried meat into leather bags. A vivid sensory moment consumed the small room as the frantic packing continued. The sharp, earthy aroma of cured tobacco, aged leather, and dry pine wood filled the air for the very last time, mingling with the cold draft pouring through the open door. The rhythmic clinking of heavy iron cooking pots being strapped into the saddlebags became a somber funeral march for the abandoned home. Gideon handed her a heavy set of lined leather gloves and a thick, woven wool scarf. His thick fingers brushed gently against her delicate wrist. This first warmth beat was a practical but deeply affectionate gesture, ensuring her fragile body could withstand the brutal journey ahead. Gideon moved to the stone hearth, lifting a heavy iron bucket of melted snow. He tossed the freezing water directly over the roaring fire. A thick, hissing cloud of gray smoke billowed up the dark chimney, instantly killing the beautiful heat of the room. The sudden, biting cold rushed inward, a stark reminder of the unforgiving wilderness waiting outside. Winona watched the massive silhouette of the mountain man, standing in the dying embers. A profound, meaningful emotional reflection struck her soul. The cowboy was abandoning the entire foundation of his life. He was surrendering his only sanctuary, his tools, and his peace to protect a woman he had known for only a few days. The absolute magnitude of his sacred sacrifice bonded her spirit to him forever. She realized that every man in her past had only taken from her, demanding obedience or political advantage. This silent giant was freely giving up his entire world to ensure she could breathe. This incredible act of pure, unselfish devotion was the most emotionally memorable moment of her tragic life. She stepped closer to his massive frame in the cold, smoky room. She reached out, resting her small, delicate hand against the coarse fabric covering his broad back. This second warmth beat was a silent vow of complete reliance. She would follow him into the absolute darkest corners of the earth. They stepped out into the freezing morning, leading the heavy pack horses and the calm roan Mustang into the deep powder. Gideon pulled the heavy wooden door shut. He slid the thick iron bolt into place, locking the empty cabin to the harsh wind. He did not look back. He handed the leather reins of the gentle Mustang to Winona, offering her a low, encouraging rumble from deep within his broad chest. She mounted the horse with a quiet grace, her dark eyes filled with absolute trust. The giant man walked ahead of her, leading his own massive horse on foot. He used his immense, muscular build to break a fresh path through the deep snow, beginning the grueling ascent toward the treacherous high pass. The jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Range loomed above them like silent, uncaring gods. As the bitter wind howled across the exposed ridges, Gideon stopped frequently, turning his towering bulk to shield her and the Mustang from the worst of the freezing gale. He checked the thick scarf around her pale face, his sharp eyes filled with fierce protective longing. This third warmth beat demonstrated his continuous, unwavering devotion to her physical safety. She was his entire world now, and he was her only unbreakable shield. The emotional progression of their journey cemented a bond of absolute emotional dependence between them. The sky above the mountains turned a bruised, darkening purple as the brutal afternoon wore on. The extreme elevation and the knee-deep powder demanded a terrible physical toll from the travelers. Winona noticed a subtle, recurring behavior from the stoic giant leading the way. Every time he paused to catch his breath, his massive right hand would subconsciously reach down to press hard against his thick thigh. as if trying to physically hold a shattered bone together. He began to favor his left leg, his massive boot dragging slightly in the heavy, wet snow. The freezing temperatures of the high altitude were violently waking the ghosts of his mysterious past. The old, deep war wounds buried within his scarred chest and thick legs began to flare with agonizing, blinding pain. The steady, powerful stride of the aging cowboy deteriorated into a strained, agonizing limp. He refused to utter a single complaint, his jaw set in pure granite beneath his graying beard. But the slowing pace was undeniably dangerous. The high pass was still miles away, completely hidden behind a curtain of swirling white mist. The terrifying realization settled heavily upon the mind of the suffering widow. The tracks they left in the deep, fresh powder were completely visible, cutting a clear path up the mountain. The brutal hunters of the tribe, men who knew the wilderness better than the wolves, were undoubtedly already following their trail. The giant was losing his immense strength to the bitter cold, and the merciless trackers were rapidly closing the distance. The secondary storm struck the high pass with absolute fury, erasing the faint trail behind the travelers in a swirling curtain of violent white powder. The agonizing limp of the aging cowboy grew steadily worse with every heavy step upward into the blinding clouds. The bitter cold of the extreme elevation penetrated the thick fur coat, violently awakening the deep, old injuries buried within the massive legs and broad chest of the giant. Winona walked closely behind the gentle Mustang, her fragile frame shielded partially by the towering bulk of her protector. She watched his massive right hand reach down to press firmly against his thick thigh, a subtle recurring behavior that revealed the immense physical agony he was silently enduring to keep her safe. The brutal trackers of the tribe were somewhere below, but the immediate, lethal threat was the plummeting temperature, freezing the blood within their veins. Through the chaotic mist of the blizzard, the sharp eyes of Gideon spotted a deep, dark fissure in the jagged rock wall of the mountain. It was a narrow cavern, sheltered from the screaming wind by a heavy overhang of ancient gray granite. He turned his broad shoulders, leading the exhausted pack horses into the dark sanctuary. A vivid sensory moment washed over the widow as they crossed the stone threshold. The deafening, shrieking howl of the wind vanished instantly, replaced entirely by the hollow, rhythmic dripping of melting ice. The still air inside the cave smelled sharply of dry earth, old limestone dust, and the faint, musky scent of departed wild animals. It was a cold, desolate stone tomb, yet the enclosure offered the only salvation against the freezing death outside. The absolute exhaustion of the brutal climb finally conquered the immense muscular build of the mountain man. Gideon secured the leather reins of the horses to a heavy stone protrusion near the entrance. He turned his massive frame toward the fragile widow, attempting to lift the heavy buffalo hide from the pack to create a safe resting place for her. His large, scarred hands shook violently. The freezing temperature had entirely drained the last reserves of his formidable strength. The heavy knees of the giant buckled completely, sending his towering bulk crashing down onto the hard, unforgiving stone floor of the cavern. Winona gasped, dropping to her knees upon the dusty stone beside the fallen giant. She reached out, placing her small, delicate hands flat against the coarse fabric covering his broad chest. This first warmth beat flowed directly from her urgent, compassionate touch, an immediate offering of profound physical support in the dark cavern. The broad chest of the cowboy heaved with shallow, ragged breaths. She recognized the deadly signs of extreme cold taking the life of a man. She knew she had to create heat immediately, or the silent protector would die upon the rock. She moved with frantic, determined grace. Gathering the dry brush and broken pine branches the wind had blown deep into the cavern over many years. Using the small flint from the heavy leather bags of the cowboy, she struck violent sparks against dry moss until a small, fragile flame finally caught life. She fed the fire carefully until a bright, steady blaze illuminated the dark stone walls of the cave. The golden light pushed the suffocating shadows deep into the corners. She dragged the heavy buffalo hide across the stone floor, positioning the thick fur extremely close to the life-giving heat. She returned to the fallen giant, wrapping her slender arms around his massive, heavy forearm. She pulled with every ounce of strength her petite frame possessed, guiding his staggering, massive bulk onto the warm hide. The thick fur coat of Gideon was entirely soaked with melting snow, transforming the protective garment into an icy, lethal weight against his freezing skin. Winona knelt close beside him, the beautiful heat of the fire washing over her flowing calico dress. She reached for the heavy horn buttons of his coat, her delicate fingers working quickly to unfasten the stiff loops. Gideon offered a low, rough rumble of protest, his fierce independence fighting against his vulnerable state. She ignored his proud resistance completely. She gently but firmly pulled the heavy fur off his broad shoulders, casting the wet garment entirely aside. This second warmth beat demonstrated her absolute devotion to his survival, proving she was completely capable of caring for the man who had risked his entire life for her. Beneath the heavy fur, the coarse linen shirt clung wetly to the heavy muscles of the giant. Winona gripped the hem of the thick fabric, pulling the wet shirt carefully over his head to prevent the freezing moisture from chilling his bones further. As the heavy garment came away, the dancing firelight washed across the exposed, massive back of the cowboy. Winona stopped breathing. A profound, meaningful emotional reflection entirely overwhelmed her fragile heart. The broad back of the mountain man was a horrifying map of absolute violence and survived agony. Deep, jagged ravines of puckered silver scars crisscrossed his thick flesh. Circular, burned marks of old bullet wounds permanently marred his heavy shoulders, and the terrible, raised lines of severe lashings told a story of unbearable, prolonged cruelty. She realized in that quiet, echoing cavern that the stoic silence of the giant was never born from an empty mind. The quiet demeanor of the mountain man was a heavy iron vault, built specifically to contain an ocean of profound trauma. The aging cowboy had absorbed the absolute worst hatred the frontier could offer, yet he had somehow managed to preserve a deep, honorable kindness within his massive chest. The deep scars of the cowboy perfectly mirrored the invisible wounds upon the heart of the tribal daughter. The emotional walls of the widow crumbled entirely. She reached out with trembling, delicate fingers, laying her small palms flat against the heavily scarred, freezing muscles of his broad back. This third warmth beat was a gesture of supreme intimacy and profound acceptance, a physical vow that she was absolutely not terrified by his brokenness. Gideon closed his sharp, serious eyes. He exhaled a long, shuddering breath, completely surrendering to the gentle, soothing heat of her touch. The fierce, untouchable mountain man allowed himself to become entirely vulnerable in the absolute presence of the suffering widow. The small fire crackled merrily, casting long, dancing shadows across the stone walls of the cavern as the violent storm raged impotently outside. The high emotional significance of the quiet moment bound the souls of the two outcasts completely together in the deep darkness. The silence of the cave stretched long into the freezing night, broken only by the steady dripping of water and the comforting sounds of the horses shifting in the shadows. Gideon sat entirely still beneath the gentle hands of Winona, his massive body finally absorbing the vital heat of the fire. The profound trust she freely offered him shattered the final heavy locks, securing his guarded soul. He turned his weathered, tanned face slightly toward the dancing flames, his voice rumbling low and rough like grinding stones. He did not look at her directly. He stared strictly into the fire, speaking the tragic truth he had hidden from the cruel world for an entire decade. He explained the terrifying insignia carved into the wooden beam of his abandoned cabin. He confessed that he was once a highly skilled scout for the violent, lawless militia of the valley below. He was a man paid to lead brutal riders into the deep wilderness. The townsfolk of the settlements despised him, not because he was a criminal, but because he had finally turned his heavy weapons against his own cruel commanders. He had absolutely refused a direct order to participate in a senseless slaughter, shooting 2 of his captains to stop a brutal raid. The terrible scars upon his back were the brutal punishment he endured for his violent mutiny. Before they banished him to the freezing peaks, Winona listened in absolute silence, her delicate hands resting completely still against his warm skin. A terrible, suffocating dread began to rise within her slender chest as the low voice of the cowboy continued the grim memory. Gideon lowered his massive head, his broad shoulders slumping heavily under the crushing weight of profound guilt. He confessed that his desperate mutiny had come entirely too late to save the innocent lives of the targets. He spoke the exact name of the sacred river where the terrible slaughter had occurred 3 winters ago. It was the identical location where the beloved fallen husband of Winona had perished. He admitted into the quiet darkness that he was the very scout who had led the violent murderers directly to her ancestral home. The profound confession of the scout hung heavily within the dark cavern, echoing softly against the cold stone walls. The fragile widow did not pull her delicate hands away from the scarred back of the cowboy. She possessed the deep, ancient wisdom of her people. She understood completely that true evil resided strictly within the cruel hearts of the men who ordered the slaughter, not within the broken soul of the man who sacrificed his entire life, attempting to stop the terrible violence. The agonizing marks of the lash upon the flesh of the giant were absolute proof of his desperate repentance. She traced the raised edge of a silver scar with her slender fingers, offering a silent, breathtaking forgiveness that completely shattered the crushing guilt of his isolated existence. The shared vulnerability of the dark night bound their spirits completely together, but the harsh reality of the freezing mountain demanded their immediate attention. By the time the violent morning light pierced the swirling mist of the high pass, a deep, rattling fever had taken root firmly within the fragile lungs of Winona. The extreme cold of the winter storm had drained the final reserves of her physical strength. The aging cowboy listened to the terrible, shallow breathing of the tribal daughter. The harsh elements of the brutal peaks were rapidly claiming her life. Gideon knew with absolute certainty they could not survive the grueling journey over the mountain without proper medicine to fight the spreading infection. He saddled the horses with heavy, deliberate movements. He turned their desperate path away from the pristine white ridges, guiding the gentle roan Mustang downward toward a deep valley entirely hidden from the cleansing sun. Located within the dark ravine was a lawless mining camp, a brutal scar upon the earth built entirely upon desperation and greed. The descent from the pure, quiet mountain into the settlement of the miners was a descent into a loud, suffocating hell. A vivid sensory moment completely overwhelmed the exhausted travelers as they crossed the muddy perimeter of the chaotic town. The freezing air hung heavy with the sharp, choking stench of burning sulfur, rotting refuse, and stale whiskey. The beautiful, sacred silence of the wilderness was entirely replaced by the rhythmic, deafening crashes of heavy iron picks against solid rock and the cruel, hollow laughter of violent men. The narrow streets of the camp were rivers of freezing brown sludge and jagged slate. Gideon led the horses through the deep mud, using his immense, muscular build to break a clear path through the crowded chaos. Winona sat upon the heavy saddle, her delicate fingers reaching deep into the pocket of the oversized linen shirt to trace the smooth wooden wings of the carved dove. This subtle recurring behavior grounded her racing heart amidst the terrifying noise of the settlement. The sudden appearance of the towering outcast and the respected tribal daughter immediately drew the bitter attention of the dark town. Rough men emerged from the doorways of canvas saloons, their faces blackened by deep soot and their cold eyes filled with malice. The townsfolk instantly recognized the massive bulk of the disgraced scout. The miners began to hurl vile, cutting insults at the aging cowboy, mocking his heavy limp and shouting cruel jests regarding the beautiful woman riding behind him. They spat dark streams of foul tobacco directly into the freezing mud near his massive boots. Gideon did not flinch. The sharp eyes of the giant remained fixed entirely upon the small wooden apothecary located at the far end of the street. He endured the absolute humiliation with stoic, unbreakable endurance. He understood perfectly that any violent reaction would immediately endanger the fragile life of the widow. He completely swallowed his fierce pride, absorbing the toxic hatred of the entire world to ensure she received the vital medicine she required. This first warmth beat was a breathtaking display of absolute emotional restraint and pure protective devotion. Winona watched the harsh, sneering faces of the brutal men. A sudden, fierce protective longing flared violently within her delicate chest. She absolutely hated the cruel men of the valley for completely failing to see the profound honor of the silent protector. The miners saw only a disgraced outcast, but she saw the most courageous spirit she had ever known in her entire life. A powerful spark of jealousy and vulnerability gripped her soul. She hated sharing the presence of the giant with people who entirely despised him. When they finally reached the wooden steps of the apothecary, Gideon reached up to help her dismount. He wrapped his massive, calloused hands gently around her slender waist. He lifted her effortlessly over the filthy sludge of the street, placing her safely upon the clean wooden planks of the porch. This second warmth beat provided a brief, vital sanctuary of emotional safety amidst the hostile environment. Winona stood tall upon the wooden steps, adjusting the thick tribal shawl over her delicate shoulders. She looked down at the gathering crowd of resentful men with an expression of absolute, unbreakable dignity. She refused to cower before their cruelty. Instead, she stepped deliberately closer to the massive frame of the cowboy. She reached out, resting her small, pale hand proudly against his thick forearm. This third warmth beat was a public, undeniable declaration of her loyalty. She was not a captive taking orders. She was a woman who freely chose to stand directly beside the hated giant. The beautiful gesture sent a powerful wave of deep emotional significance straight into the guarded heart of the mountain man. Gideon turned his broad back toward the jeering crowd, stepping forward to open the heavy door of the apothecary to secure the necessary medicine. He left the fragile widow standing near the edge of the porch for only a single, brief second. From the dark shadows of the adjacent saloon, a heavily intoxicated miner stumbled violently into the muddy street. The filthy man completely ignored the terrifying reputation of the mountain man. He lunged forward with a twisted, mocking grin, extending a grease-stained hand directly toward the pristine calico dress of the tribal daughter. Before anyone could draw a single breath, the brutal, unwashed fingers of the drunken miner clamped harshly around the slender arm of Winona, yanking her violently toward the freezing mud. The sudden, violent pull upon the slender arm of Winona shattered the tense standoff in the lawless street. The drunken miner possessed the blind courage of bad whiskey, completely ignoring the absolute peril of his actions. A sharp gasp escaped the pale lips of the tribal daughter as she stumbled toward the freezing, contaminated mud. The fragile widow did not fall. Before the filthy knees of the miner could even bend to drag her down, the stoic restraint of the aging cowboy completely vanished. Gideon did not yell. He did not draw the heavy iron revolver from his hip. The silent protector simply moved with the devastating, unstoppable force of a collapsing mountain. He spun away from the wooden door of the apothecary, his wide-legged trousers snapping against the bitter wind. He reached out with one massive, calloused hand, and, locking his thick fingers completely around the filthy wrist of the attacker. The grip of the giant was absolute iron. The cruel, mocking grin of the miner vanished instantly, entirely replaced by a mask of sudden, paralyzing terror. The cowboy squeezed the wrist of the man until a dull, sickening pop echoed through the quiet street. The intoxicated fool released the calico dress of Winona instantly, crying out in sudden agony. In a desperate panic, the miner reached into his ragged canvas coat with his free hand, drawing a jagged, rusted skinning knife. He slashed the dull weapon wildly through the freezing air. The sharp edge caught the thick forearm of Gideon, slicing deeply through the coarse fabric of his worn-out shirt and biting harshly into the heavy muscles beneath. Gideon did not flinch from the sudden violence. The sharp eyes of the mountain man remained entirely focused upon the safety of the fragile woman. He stepped fully into the attack, utilizing his immense muscular build to drive his broad shoulder directly into the chest of the drunken fool. The incredible physical impact launched the miner backward through the freezing air. The man crashed violently into the deep sludge of the street, completely incapacitated and gasping for breath. The sudden, overwhelming display of blunt force entirely neutralized the immediate threat without requiring a single drop of lethal violence. The unruly crowd of hostile townsfolk fell entirely silent. Stepping backward in total fear of the bleeding giant, Gideon turned his massive frame immediately toward Winona. He ignored the warm blood flowing rapidly down his thick forearm. He reached out with his uninjured hand, gently touching the slender shoulder of the widow to ensure she was entirely unharmed. This first warmth beat was a profound display of pure protective devotion. The immediate safety of the fragile woman completely eclipsed his own physical pain. The dark, soulful eyes of the tribal daughter met his serious gaze, offering a silent vow of profound gratitude. The frightened apothecary cautiously opened the heavy wooden door, extending a small glass bottle of vital medicine toward the towering outcast. Gideon placed a silver coin upon the wooden planks, securing the necessary cure. He turned away from the hostile town forever. He lifted the delicate widow into the heavy saddle of the roan mustang, his movements incredibly gentle despite his bleeding wound. They rode away from the suffocating noise of the mining camp, pushing the horses hard toward the steep, ascending trails of the high timber. The vivid sensory moment shifted dramatically as they left the foul stench of the settlement behind. The crisp, clean scent of high-altitude pine needles completely replaced the odor of burning sulfur. Wet, the hollow, cruel laughter of the miners faded into the beautiful, sacred silence of the deep forest. The bitter winter wind kissed the pale cheeks of Winona, bringing a shocking clarity to her racing mind. They stopped in a small grove of ancient cedar trees to rest the exhausted animals. Gideon leaned heavily against the thick trunk of a massive tree. The profound exhaustion of the brutal journey and the new injury entirely drained the legendary strength of the giant. Winona slid gracefully from the saddle, moving immediately to his side. She reached into the deep pocket of the oversized linen shirt, her delicate fingers brushing against the smooth wood of the carved dove. This subtle recurring behavior instantly anchored her courage. She knelt beside the giant, retrieving a clean strip of white linen from the heavy saddlebags. The blood of the cowboy stained his thick arm, a bright crimson contrast against the pale winter snow. Winona wrapped the clean bandage tightly around his massive forearm, her small hands moving with skilled, deliberate pressure. She poured a small measure of the precious medicine directly over the deep cut to prevent the foul dirt of the town from taking root. This second warmth beat was a beautiful reversal of roles. The suffering widow was now providing the exact physical healing she had desperately required just days before. Gideon watched the delicate, fragile features of the tribal daughter as she worked. He offered a low, rumbling breath of absolute comfort, resting his heavy, calloused hand gently over her small fingers once the bandage was completely secured. This third warmth beat transferred a profound emotional safety directly into her soul. He was not angry about the injury. He was entirely grateful that she was safe. A deep, meaningful emotional reflection washed over the fragile heart of Winona as she looked up into his weathered, tanned face. She realized with absolute, terrifying clarity that her soul was completely bound to this aging giant. The political demands of her ambitious brother, the cruel judgments of the white settlements, and the tragic ghosts of her past entirely faded into nothingness. The only thing that truly mattered in the entire world was the slow, steady rhythm of the heavy chest breathing before her. The intense fear of loss gripped her delicate spirit. She feared losing this silent protector, far more than she feared the brutal men hunting them. The brief sanctuary of the quiet grove did not last. The deep cut upon the thick arm of the cowboy began to throb with a dangerous, unnatural heat. The rusted blade of the miner carried a vicious poison, and the wound began to fester rapidly, despite the careful cleaning. The heavy fever returned, not to the fragile lungs of the widow, but to the massive frame of the giant. Gideon closed his sharp eyes, his broad shoulders slumping heavily against the ancient cedar. Winona turned her dark gaze toward the distant, exposed ridge they had just crossed hours ago. The freezing wind carried the faint, terrifying sound of heavy hooves striking solid stone. She peered through the dark branches of the timber. Moving slowly along the high, snowy skyline was a distinct line of mounted warriors. The colorful, dyed feathers of the chief snapped violently in the bitter gale. The tracking party of the tribe had found their trail, and the brutal hunters were now just miles behind them. The steep ascent into the dark clouds of the high mountain pass demanded a terrible, unforgiving price from the fleeing outcasts. The deep cut upon the thick forearm of the aging cowboy burned with an unnatural, lethal heat. The vile poison from the rusted blade of the miner spread rapidly through the massive frame of the giant, warring violently against the freezing temperature of the bitter mountain. Gideon pushed the gentle roan mustang forward, leading the beautiful but suffering widow higher into the treacherous peaks as the last golden light of the winter sun completely vanished behind the jagged ridges. The terrifying silhouettes of the tribal hunters remained miles behind them, but the fast, relentless pace of the war party promised a deadly confrontation before the dawn. A vivid sensory moment consumed the high ridge as the total darkness of the mountain night descended. The air grew so incredibly thin and violently cold that every desperate breath tasted of sharp ozone and crushed ice. The howling wind screamed through the ancient granite pillars, a deafening, chaotic noise that masked the agonizing, ragged groans escaping the broad chest of the mountain man. The pristine snow beneath their heavy boots glowed with an eerie, pale blue luminescence under the rising winter moon, casting long, ghostly shadows across the treacherous trail. They reached a small, shallow depression surrounded by tall, ancient pines. It was not a true sanctuary, but the thick timber offered a small physical barrier against the shrieking gale. Gideon pulled the heavy leather reins of the horses, signaling a temporary halt for the exhausted animals. The immense, muscular build of the cowboy swayed dangerously as he stepped through the deep powder. The terrifying fever entirely saturated his blood, causing his massive shoulders to tremble uncontrollably beneath his coarse, worn-out shirt. Winona slipped quickly from the heavy saddle, the flowing hem of her delicate calico dress dragging through the fresh snow. She rushed immediately to the side of the silent protector. The fragile widow reached deep into the pocket of the oversized linen shirt she wore, her slender fingers tracing the smooth, perfect wings of the carved wooden dove. This subtle recurring behavior anchored her terrified spirit, reminding her of the profound, unspoken devotion the giant held for her broken heart. She looked up into his weathered, tanned face. The sharp, serious eyes of the cowboy were glazed with deep physical pain and dangerous delirium. Gideon ignored his failing strength completely. He reached into the leather saddlebags with trembling, calloused fingers, pulling out the heaviest buffalo hide. He wrapped the thick fur securely around the slender shoulders of the tribal daughter, completely engulfing her fragile form in absolute warmth. This first warmth beat was an act of pure, stubborn devotion. The giant was literally freezing to death, yet he surrendered his only shield against the bitter elements to ensure her survival. He offered a low, rough murmur of comfort, a sound completely devoid of fear despite his desperate condition. The cowboy then stepped away from the meager shelter of the trees. He turned his broad back toward her, facing the dark, descending trail they had just climbed. He raised the heavy iron barrel of his rifle, bracing his massive boots against the slippery rock. He absolutely refused to sleep. He intended to stand guard in the freezing blizzard, a solitary, unbreakable wall of muscle and bone, waiting for the inevitable arrival of the cruel hunters. Winona watched the towering silhouette of the outcast, standing against the raging storm. A profound, meaningful emotional reflection completely shattered the stoic demeanor she had maintained since the tragic death of her fallen husband. She realized with absolute clarity that she could not exist in this harsh world without the quiet, honorable giant. The deep emotional walls she had built to survive the betrayal of her blood family entirely crumbled into dust. Her fierce independence melted into a desperate, absolute emotional dependence. She did not merely want the cowboy to survive. She needed his steady, quiet presence to simply breathe. She stepped forward, abandoning the safety of the heavy timber. She walked directly into the biting wind, wrapping her delicate arms tightly around the thick, muscular waist of the giant. She pressed her pale cheek flat against the center of his broad back, feeling the unnatural, terrifying heat radiating through his coarse shirt. This second warmth beat was a desperate, physical plea. She held him tightly, pouring every ounce of her remaining strength into his trembling frame, attempting to anchor his failing body to the earth. "You must rest," Winona pleaded, her fragile voice cracking violently under the crushing weight of her profound fear of her. Hot, desperate tears spilled freely over her pale cheeks, freezing almost instantly in the bitter air. She dropped all pretense of polite distance, burying her face into his warm shoulder. "You will die standing upon this rock. I cannot lose you. I will not let you die for me." The aging cowboy lowered the heavy rifle slightly. He turned his massive head, looking down over his broad shoulder at the weeping woman clinging to his waist. The fierce, untouchable mountain man felt the hot tears of the widow soaking through his thin shirt. The desperate longing in her voice struck his guarded heart with the force of a falling star. He shifted his towering bulk, turning completely around to face her. Gideon reached out with his uninjured hand. He did not issue a stern command, nor did he offer false promises of safety. He gently brushed his thick, scarred thumb across her pale cheek, wiping away the freezing tears with breathtaking tenderness. This third warmth beat was an incredibly intimate, emotionally memorable moment that permanently erased the boundary between protector and protected. The gentle touch carried the profound weight of 1,000 unspoken confessions. He looked into her dark, soulful eyes, his own gaze filled with a desperate, tragic affection. He wanted to give her a beautiful, peaceful life in a hidden valley, but the terrible poison racing through his veins was rapidly stealing his future. The silent protector attempted to raise the heavy rifle once more, determined to hold the line against the approaching darkness. However, the cruel fever and the extreme exhaustion finally demanded their absolute toll. The massive frame of the giant shuddered violently. The heavy iron weapon slipped completely from his numb fingers, crashing heavily into the icy snow. Winona cried out in absolute terror as the towering strength of the mountain man finally broke. The immense knees of the cowboy buckled entirely. He collapsed forward like a felled ancient cedar, his massive bulk crashing heavily into the deep powder. The fragile widow fell to her knees beside his unconscious body, desperately grasping his broad shoulders in a frantic attempt to wake him. The howling wind suddenly masked the terrible sound of snapping branches just beyond the edge of their small clearing. Winona lifted her tear-stained face, her breath catching tightly in her throat. Through the swirling white mist and the dark shadows of the ancient pines, a line of tall, silent figures began to move deliberately into the open snow. The towering figures moving slowly through the dark timber were not the brutal hunters of the tribe. The shifting light of the winter moon created a natural canvas of deep chiaroscuro, lighting across the high mountain pass, painting the ancient pine trees with thick, heavy strokes of absolute blackness against the brilliant white snow. The entire frozen wilderness felt like a beautiful, moving oil painting brought to sudden, freezing life. The terrified breath of Winona caught tightly in her throat as a small herd of massive winter elk stepped deliberately into the frozen clearing. The majestic animals ignored the fallen giant entirely, moving like silent, breathing ghosts through the howling storm. The immediate threat of the war party remained hidden in the darkness below. But the brutal reality of the dying cowboy demanded the absolute focus of the fragile widow. Gideon lay completely motionless upon the icy ground. His massive chest heaved with shallow, rattling breaths that sounded like grinding stones. The terrible fever from the rusted blade of the miner had entirely conquered his immense, muscular build. Winona dropped to her knees in the deep powder, entirely ignoring the freezing moisture soaking through her delicate calico dress. She reached into the deep pocket of the oversized linen shirt she wore, her slender fingers brushing against the smooth wood of the carved dove. This subtle recurring behavior instantly anchored her terrified spirit. She was no longer the fragile, suffering widow running from the cruel judgments of the world. She was the absolute guardian of the honorable man she loved. Winona dragged the heavy buffalo hide away from her own slender shoulders. She spread the thick fur meticulously over the massive, unconscious form of the cowboy, tucking the edges tightly against his broad chest to trap the failing heat of his body. This first warmth beat was a profound reversal of their established roles. The aging giant had sacrificed his only bed, his thick coat, and his entire sanctuary to keep her warm. Now, she offered every ounce of physical comfort she possessed to shield him from the bitter wind. She would gladly freeze upon the mountain if it meant his large, calloused hands would remain warm. The fragile daughter of the tribe retrieved her small leather pouch of traditional medicine from the saddlebags of the gentle roan mustang. She knelt beside the thick, injured arm of the cowboy. The deep cut was swollen with a terrifying, unnatural heat that radiated through the freezing air. She mixed the last remaining portion of her healing roots with a handful of clean snow, creating a cold, drawing poultice. She applied the mixture directly to the festering wound of the giant, her small hands moving with fierce, desperate precision. This second warmth beat was a beautiful act of pure devotion. She poured her ancient knowledge into the scarred flesh of the mountain man, fighting the dark poison of the white settlement with the profound healing light of her people. A vivid sensory moment completely enveloped the quiet clearing as the wind momentarily died away. The sharp coarse, bitter scent of the crushed medicinal roots entirely overpowered the metallic smell of fresh snow and old pine sap. The howling gale began to soften into a low, mournful whisper as the deepest, darkest hours of the long night slowly surrendered to the approaching dawn. The heavy, tough, iron barrel of the fallen rifle lay half buried in the freezing powder near the boots of the giant. Winona reached out with trembling hands, wrapping her slender fingers around the freezing metal. The weapon was incredibly heavy, built specifically for the massive hands of the cowboy. But she lifted it from the ice with an absolute, unbreakable determination. She stood tall over the unconscious body of the mountain man. She possessed the delicate, fragile features of a porcelain doll, yet she held the heavy rifle with the fierce, unwavering courage of a seasoned warrior defending a sacred temple. A deep, meaningful emotional reflection entirely transformed her soul in the quiet darkness. Throughout the brutal journey, she had wondered why the solitary outcast continued to risk his life for a broken stranger. Looking down at the beautiful, quiet face of the giant, she finally understood the profound truth. Love was not found in the easy, safe moments of life. True love was the absolute willingness to stand directly between the terrible darkness and the person you cherish. She had become the silent protector. The pale, golden light of the morning sun began to bleed over the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Range, casting a breathtaking illumination across the high pass. Winona lowered her dark, soulful eyes to the weathered, tanned face of the giant. She reached down with her free hand, gently brushing a thick lock of dark hair away from his burning forehead. This third warmth beat was a silent, emotionally memorable promise that bound her spirit to his forever. She leaned close to his ear, her voice a soft, fierce whisper in the freezing air. "I will not let them take you," Winona breathed, her words carrying the heavy weight of an absolute vow. "You have carried my grief, and I will carry your shield. I will not leave you." She stood upright once more, raising the heavy stock of the rifle squarely against her slender shoulder. She faced the dark, ascending trail with absolute, unyielding defiance. She was completely prepared to pull the heavy iron trigger against her own blood to ensure the survival of the honorable cowboy. She would secure his second chance at life, even if the terrible cost was her own. The absolute silence of the new morning shattered violently. The sharp, terrifying crunch of heavy boots breaking the icy crust of the snow echoed from the dark timber. The majestic elk scattered instantly into the deep woods, vanishing like smoke. The fragile widow tightened her grip upon the freezing metal of the weapon, aiming the dark barrel directly at the center of the narrow path. The fast, relentless pace of the tracking party had finally overtaken them. A single, towering figure emerged slowly from the deep shadows of the ancient pines. The brilliant, dyed feathers, woven into the thick hair of the warrior, snapped in the bitter wind. The heavy, adorned buffalo robes confirmed his terrifying identity. The brother of Winona stepped fully into the clearing, completely alone. His dark eyes locked instantly upon the slender form of his sister, aiming the massive weapon of the white man directly at his chest. The cruel chief did not flinch. He raised his heavy, steel-tipped spear, pointing the lethal weapon directly toward the unconscious bulk of the mountain man lying in the deep powder. The terrifying standoff between the blood of the tribe and the profound loyalty of the widow reached an absolute, critical breaking point. Two entirely different worlds collided upon the high ridge, separated only by the trembling finger of a desperate woman. "Drop the weapon," the brother commanded, his voice cold and completely devoid of any familial warmth. "Step away from the dying giant, and you will live." The cold command of the brother echoed across the frozen clearing, a harsh intrusion upon the sacred silence of the high mountain pass. Winona did not lower the heavy iron barrel of the rifle. A vivid sensory moment completely enveloped the terrifying standoff. The brilliant, rising morning sun reflected fiercely off the pristine snow, creating a blinding, pure white glare that burned the eyes. The sharp and metallic scent of cold steel and burnt black powder mixed heavily with the earthy, rich smell of the thick buffalo robes worn by the chief. The absolute silence of the wilderness returned immediately after the cruel words faded, feeling heavy and completely suffocating, as the ancient pines stood as silent witnesses waiting for the devastating crack of the weapon. The fragile widow tightened her small hands around the freezing metal. She felt the immense, unbearable weight of the weapon pulling at her slender shoulders, but her resolve remained absolute iron. She pressed her arm tightly against the deep pocket of the oversized linen shirt, feeling the solid, familiar shape of the carved wooden dove resting against her side. This subtle recurring behavior reinforced her profound courage, reminding her of the beautiful, quiet honor of the fallen giant lying in the snow behind her. She was no longer a piece of disposable political property. She was a woman who had finally discovered true, unconditional love, and she absolutely refused to surrender her newfound dignity. "I will not step away," Winona answered, her voice ringing clear and completely steady through the bitter winter air. "You do not hold the power to dictate my fate any longer. You traded the honor of our family for a coward. If you wish to take the life of this honorable man, you must pass the blade of your weapon through my heart first." The chief of the tribe narrowed his dark eyes. The shocking defiance of his sister completely insulted his absolute authority. He took a heavy, deliberate step forward, his thick boots crushing the icy crust of the powder with a sickening crunch. He raised the heavy, steel-tipped spear higher, aiming the lethal point directly at the chest of the fragile woman. The profound tragedy of the terrifying moment settled heavily upon the clearing. A brother and a sister, bound entirely by the ancient blood of their esteemed people, standing as absolute enemies over the frozen body of a hated outcast. Beneath the thick buffalo hide, the deep, rattling breaths of the aging cowboy suddenly shifted. The fierce, desperate voice of the woman he loved pierced the suffocating darkness of his terrifying fever. Gideon heard the absolute devotion ringing in her beautiful words. He heard the fragile daughter of the tribe offering her own sacred life to purchase his survival. The profound revelation of true, unconditional love struck the guarded heart of the mountain man like a violent bolt of lightning. The immense, overwhelming affection he held for her completely overpowered the lethal poison burning through his thick veins. The giant man moved. The heavy fur slid from his broad shoulders as he pushed his massive, scarred hands against the unforgiving ice. A terrible groan of absolute physical agony escaped his pale lips, but he refused to remain upon the ground, while the woman he cherished faced the deadly wrath of her own blood. The immense, muscular build of the cowboy trembled violently. He forced his heavy boots beneath his towering bulk, staggering upward with an impossible, superhuman determination. He rose like a battered, ancient mountain, absolutely refusing to crumble into the sea. Winona gasped, her dark, soulful eyes widening in absolute shock as the massive shadow of the giant fell over her fragile form. Gideon stood directly behind her, his broad chest heaving with desperate, agonizing effort. He reached forward with his massive, uninjured hand. He did not grab the weapon with anger or panic. He gently laid his thick, calloused fingers over her small, trembling hands, slowly lowering the heavy barrel of the rifle toward the deep snow. This first warmth beat was a breathtaking act of pure grace. He absolutely refused to let the gentle woman bear the terrible, permanent burden of shooting her own brother. He would carry the heavy weight of the violence, so her beautiful soul could remain entirely pure. The cowboy stepped deliberately around the fragile widow, positioning his towering frame exactly between her slender body and the lethal spear of the chief. He used his immense bulk to completely shield her from the cruel eyes of the hunting party. This second warmth beat was the ultimate manifestation of his protective devotion. The giant had absolutely nothing left to fight with. His heavy arms hung loosely at his sides. His breathing remained ragged and shallow, yet he stood as an unbreakable fortress of pure love. He was entirely ready to embrace the dark sleep of death, simply to ensure she could see another sunrise. Gideon looked directly into the harsh, painted face of the chief. The sharp, serious eyes of the giant held absolutely no fear, only a profound, quiet dignity. He did not plead for his own miserable life. "The woman is free," the rough voice of the mountain man rumbled, sounding incredibly weak, but filled with absolute conviction. "She owes no debt to you or your violent peace. I will gladly pay the final price for her freedom. Take my life upon this rock, but you will leave her to walk the earth without chains." A deep, meaningful emotional reflection completely overwhelmed Winona. She witnessed the ultimate sacrifice unfolding before her eyes. The silent protector was freely surrendering his final breath, asking the cruel world for absolutely nothing in return except her complete safety. He was offering the ultimate price of peace. The crushing fear within her chest entirely vanished, completely replaced by a fierce, blinding devotion. The fragile widow absolutely refused to cower behind his broad back. She stepped forward immediately, wrapping her slender arms tightly around the thick waist of the giant, pressing her delicate face against his coarse, worn-out shirt. She anchored his swaying body with her own desperate strength, refusing to let him stand alone against the bitter end. This third warmth beat demonstrated their complete, unbreakable unity. They were no longer two solitary outcasts running from the shadows of their pasts. They were one complete soul, bound forever in the freezing snow. The heavy silence of the mountain stretched into a terrifying eternity. The brother of Winona stared at the impossible, breathtaking sight before him. The aging giant, bleeding and dying, offering his life for a woman of another world, without a single moment of hesitation. The fragile sister, abandoning her esteemed heritage and her deep fear to die beside a hated outcast. The chief gripped the wooden shaft of his weapon with white knuckles. He drew a deep, ragged breath of the bitter air. He stepped forward, raising the heavy spear high above his head. the sharp steel gleaming violently in the bright winter sun. The tension reaching a complete, devastating breaking point as two entirely different worlds collided in the quiet snow. The heavy steel tip of the spear hung suspended in the freezing air. The breath of the chief plumed in thick, white clouds. He looked closely at the tears freezing upon the pale cheeks of his sister. He saw no fear of him, only a profound, unbreakable determination to protect the bleeding man at her feet. He then looked at the massive chest of the outcast. The giant offered his life without a single ounce of hesitation, choosing death over the captivity of the woman. The profound truth of their bond completely shattered the political ambitions of the warrior. The chief possessed an empire of mounted warriors, but he knew in his heart he possessed absolutely nothing as pure or powerful as the devotion standing before him. True strength did not reside in treaties forged by cruelty and forced marriages. It existed entirely in the unbreakable loyalty displayed in the deep powder. The brother slowly lowered his muscular arm. The heavy, steel-tipped weapon struck the ice with a dull, hollow sound. "You are absolutely dead to our people," the chief declared, his harsh voice softening into a quiet, heavy resignation. "Do not ever return to the valley. I will tell the elders, you perished in the blizzard. I will not stain my hands with the blood of a man who possesses such rare, profound honor. Walk into the high mountains, and may the ancient spirits grant you the peace you have purchased today." He turned his heavy buffalo robes, walking slowly back into the dark timber without looking back. The terrifying threat vanished completely, leaving only the whistling wind and the quiet breathing of the survivors. The immense tension completely left the clearing. The massive knees of Gideon finally gave way entirely. He collapsed backward into the deep snow, his remaining strength entirely spent. But he pulled the fragile widow securely with him, so she did not fall. Winona held his broad shoulders tightly, pressing her face against his chest. This first warmth beat was a profound release of the paralyzing terror they had carried for days. She immediately gathered fresh snow, mixing it frantically with her remaining medicinal roots. She absolutely refused to lose him to the fever after they had defeated the wrath of the world. The next few days passed in a slow, agonizing blur of absolute survival. Winona guided the gentle roan Mustang down the far side of the treacherous pass, leading the heavy pack horses through narrow, winding canyons. As they descended, the bitter cold began to soften. They emerged into a breathtaking, hidden valley completely untouched by the violent hands of men. A vivid sensory moment enveloped them. The bitter howling wind entirely disappeared, replaced by the gentle, melodic bubbling of a clear, steaming hot spring and the sweet, rich scent of blooming winter sage. The warm air rising from the valley floor melted the thick powder, revealing soft, vibrant green moss and ancient, sheltering oaks. Winona built a sturdy shelter of thick branches near the healing waters. She tended the deep, festering wounds of the cowboy with absolute, tireless devotion. She bathed his burning skin with the warm mineral water, singing the ancient tribal lullaby to soothe his troubled mind. The terrible fever finally broke completely on the fourth night. Gideon opened his sharp, serious eyes, his mind entirely clear of the dark delirium. He felt the delicate hand of Winona resting perfectly against his scarred chest, rising and falling with his steady breath. This second warmth beat secured the profound realization of his survival. He looked around the peaceful, blooming valley, realizing he had finally found a true home. Many peaceful months later, the rough, sturdy timber walls of a new, beautiful cabin stood strong against the base of the mountain. The aging giant walked across the soft grass, his heavy limp entirely healed by time and careful rest. The deep, jagged scars upon his back remained as a testament to his survival. But the profound, suffocating guilt no longer poisoned his soul. He found Winona sitting near the warm edge of the clear spring. She held the carved wooden dove, smoothing the perfect wings with her slender fingers. This subtle recurring behavior no longer represented an anchor against terror. It was now a gentle meditation of pure gratitude. She looked up as the giant approached, her dark, soulful eyes radiating complete, earned happiness. A deep, meaningful emotional reflection filled her spirit. She had lost the prestigious title of her past, but she had gained a magnificent future built upon absolute, unbreakable trust. Gideon knelt slowly beside her upon the soft moss. He reached out with his massive, calloused hand, taking the small wooden carving from her fingers and placing it gently upon the ground. He enveloped her delicate hands entirely within his protective grasp. This third warmth beat was the ultimate, deeply earned emotional payoff. He did not offer loud, poetic declarations of romance. He offered his absolute, unwavering presence. He leaned forward, pressing his warm lips softly against her pale forehead, a gesture of supreme respect and profound adoration. The romantic resolution was quiet, profound, and entirely unbreakable. The solitary outcast and the suffering widow had successfully forged their own magnificent kingdom of peace. And so, the dark shadows of the painful past completely faded into the warm, golden light of the hidden valley. The giant mountain man and the beautiful tribal daughter built a legacy of pure love that far outlasted the cruel judgments of Zolwitstans and the violent political wars of the plains. They learned the most profound life lesson the harsh frontier could ever teach a willing soul. True belonging is never granted by ancient bloodlines or the fickle opinions of bitter men. Belonging is built, piece by beautiful piece, by two broken people actively choosing to stand together when the entire world commands them to fall apart. We all carry heavy, invisible scars, painful marks of the difficult battles we have survived in the quiet darkness of our own lives. We often believe those deep wounds make us unlovable, unworthy, or completely broken beyond repair. But as the silent protector and the suffering widow discovered upon the freezing mountain, the right soul will never demand you hide your painful history. True love will simply stand beside you in the bitter cold and help you build a brand new fire. Forgiveness is a terribly difficult mountain to climb, and absolute healing requires immense courage. But the magnificent view from the summit of a second chance is worth every agonizing step. May you always find the quiet strength to offer kindness to the misunderstood outcasts of the world. May you possess the fierce bravery to protect the ones you deeply cherish, even when the brutal storm rages at your door. The storytelling campfire is burning low now, my friends. The bright stars are shining over the high ridges, and this old, beautiful memory has finally found its peaceful rest. This story is a work of fiction. The characters, places, and events portrayed in this narrative are entirely fictitious. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual historical events is completely coincidental. The purpose of this story is to provide emotional healing, comfort, and peaceful entertainment.